So I'll now hand you over to William. So welcome and thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. And it's absolutely wonderful to be here with you today. And this is a subject that is near and dear to my heart. It's the subject of initiation is very much woven into the esoteric philosophy on many levels. We talk about initiation when it comes to an individual, and that's what our focus is today. But we also talk about initiation in terms of larger systems, like, for instance, humanity itself. And it is believed that humanity itself is approaching a great initiation probably this century, and we're right now in the so-called burning ground leading up to it. But so it's a very big subject. And what I'd like to do today is I'd like to have our first module, our first section. I want to focus on some very fundamental things and a few things to say about initiations as a whole. And then in the subsequent modules is when I will focus on the specific initiations and what the implications are. And as we go through this, I want you to realize that as I go through the individual initiations and describe how to understand them, truthfully, you're going to pretty much recognize elements of all of them in you. And because there's initiation and the path to enlightenment, you might say, there's both a simultaneity to its development as well as a sequentiality. And so, for instance, when I talk about the first initiation and the second and the third, you're going to say to yourself, well, I kind of recognize that in me. Well, I kind of recognize that too. And that's okay, because in a certain sense, you are working on all three. But in time and space, viewed from a multi-incarnational perspective, there is an emphasized steps to development leading to ultimate enlightenment, really. So our first module, though, is to focus on some of the fundamentals. And I'm not sure how much all of you are aware of or familiar with the esoteric philosophy. I'm not sure if you're all really experienced in it, or it's a mix of people of different levels of knowledge. But I want to start with just making sure that I want to define three terms for you. And it has to do with what is called the three periodical vehicles. And I want to make sure we understand these three periodical vehicles because they are all pertinent when it comes to the subject of initiation. So periodical vehicles represent places of self-realization deep within. And there are said to be three places inside us where identity, the sense of identity, realizes itself. And I'm just going to put a little overhead on the screen here to highlight this. Let me just get this here and share the screen. Hopefully you're able to see that okay?
Yeah.
And so the first periodical is the one we're most familiar with, the personality. So personality is the lower self, as you know. And the personality represents, as it says here, the innate intelligence of triple form life. Now, whenever we talk about the personality, we're talking about what is sometimes called the threefold personality. The personality is a combination of it has a mental component, emotional component, and a mental component. And when we talk about an integrated personality, we're talking about all three of those parts of the personality working effectively in an integrated way. So that's the part of our sense of self that we are so familiar with. Now, when you're on the path, you're waking up to this sense of self, what we call soul, the higher self, the conveyor of spiritual love and wisdom through the agency of loving mind. Now, there's a lot to be said about soul, and I'll be mentioning it in many different ways throughout this presentation. And the assumption that with all of you is that you have had some sort of awakening to the soul already. And so, in a way, we have a dual recognition of identity, our sense of day-to-day consciousness, personality, and the sense of that higher quality within us, that higher, wiser faculty. And in many ways, our whole journey is to lift our consciousness out of its identification with personality and re-identify it with that higher part of us. And in many ways, initiation is about that process. And the third periodical vehicle is the deepest and subtlest, called the monad. The monad represents pure spirit. As it says here, it's the divine self, represents pure spirit, and conveys will and purpose. Now, the monad is a whole study in itself. It's a phenomenally interesting subject. And as it says, it's beyond the soul, meaning when I say beyond the soul, I mean it's even deeper than and subtler than the soul. And for us, the monad is probably not in view. There's a certain initiatory point, which we will get into, where you have your first awakening to the monad. For you and I, the goal is to recognize the duality of soul and personality, and the process of trying to lift the lower and become more identified with the soul. But there will be some initiations that you'll see later on today that actually start to get more into the intimacy with the monad. So we'll get into that as well. I wanted to give you those three terms so that you know what I'm talking about. Now, in a certain sense, each of these three are places where life looks out and says, I am this. I am the lowest part is I am personality. Soul is seeing itself in a different way, and ultimately the monad sees itself in yet a different way. I'm going to show you another slide that maybe helps in that thought. So let me put that up here for a moment. I call it the voice of identity, the voice of identity. So we start out, and by the way, I'm hoping that you're able to read this on the screen. Are you able to see this okay?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. So there's like 4 stages in the process of realizing self. And the first stage is the voice of the non-integrated personality. Now, remember, I mentioned it just a moment ago that there's 3 parts to the personality, and the mental, emotional, and physical. And when they're not integrated, I mean, in many ways, for most of our incarnational history, it's a process of slowly integrating the personality. And so for the masses in the world today, largely they're living non-integrated personality life. Now, but they each kind of have a voice to their own self. So let me share with you that. So the voice of the non-integrated personality is simply, I am what I do. In other words, the non-integrated personality can really only understand itself through its actions. Now, the integrated personality, which is the powerful ego, that is where the mental, emotional, and physical part of the personality work well together, that part of the personality is where we have the development of ego. And here's a way it speaks to itself. I am the knowledge that I have and can use. I stand as individual, unique, and proud. So that's, and again, this is sort of pre-awakening to the soul. Here's what the soul says to itself, the consciousness of your causal body. The soul. I am the wisdom gained over countless lives. Selfless love directs my course. I travel not alone. So here's that part of us that recognizes that we are agency of Christ-like love that is much more selfless, and that we are all, the soul in each of us is made up of 2 fundamental qualities. The causal body is the container deep inside us that's holding our soul consciousness, and it's the source of Christ-like love. In fact, the composition of the causal body is by its very nature Christ-like. Truly, your causal body is the Christ in you. And it's also the storehouse of acquired wisdom that has been earned through the crucible of countless incarnations. So your soul consciousness is a combination of acquired wisdom and a sense of higher, more selfless, almost Christ-like love. And yet it says in the last part of it, I travel not alone. The soul part of you is the part of you that knows that you're a part within a larger whole. The soul part of you is the part of you that recognizes that on a subtler level, we're all one. And so the further you come into your soul consciousness, the more that becomes an experiential knowingness. and not simply a theoretical proposition. And the monad would say this to itself, and it'll sound paradoxical. I am that which has always been. In me all paradox is resolved. I exist, and yet I do not. And I know that sounds a little strange, but what that's really about is, it's really about recognizing that at the level of pure monad, which is beyond our ability at this point, it's where a master lives. A master has transcended soul. A master is living fully the consciousness or the beingness of monad. But monad is beyond all categories of thought. And even when we think about existence, we say, I exist. Well, monad is a place inside us that is so transcendent that all paradox is resolved. So masculine, feminine, right and wrong, light and dark, all of the paradoxical, oppositional, opposite energies and patterns of consciousness that we can experience at the soul level and certainly at the personality level, all of that is transcended and resolved. So even the perception of existence is only understood by us because we have a perception of non-existence. We contrast it. And because of that contrast, we understand existence. But at the level of the monad, from a certain perspective, that both are true. I know it sounds paradoxical, but welcome to the deeper world that we're all headed toward. Okay, so that's just a way of understanding how these three periodical vehicles sort of see themselves. All right, now, let's talk about initiation. First, initiation is really just a story of sort of representing milestones of evolutionary development. For a very long time, there's a huge journey having to do with just developing that personality. And if we look at our whole incarnational history, we have been on a journey for by far the majority of our incarnations, each of us, have been not about soul, but about cultivating personality. And yet there comes a time when you wake up to the soul, and we're going to talk about that. It's called the awakening, where for the first time you recognize your own duality. You recognize there is a higher thing inside me. And the game changes from that point on. And so from that point on, everything is incrementally moving toward full enlightenment. And eventually it's taking you back to become the monad itself in a more conscious way. First to become soul, then ultimately to become the monad. Now, the word initiation is interesting because it kind of represents both an alpha and an omega. It's both a beginning and an ending. It's the end to an initiation. Each of them is the end of a major cycle of evolutionary development, but it's also the starting point of another cycle. The word initiate or initiate means to begin as well, you see. And each initiation is representing an expansion of consciousness. Now, that's a big subject in itself. What do we mean by expanded consciousness? On one level, we mean it as if you lift your consciousness and can sense that more soulful dimension of yourself, there should be a sense of a widening as well. But never forget that on an esoterically understood, that there's this principle of hylozoism that says that every unit of life in the end is a unit of life within a larger living system. So when we say we are expanding our consciousness, it's not just that we're expanding into soul consciousness, but we're also expanding into the consciousness of the greater life that you and I are cells within. And we could talk about that greater life in many ways. For us, the greater life would be the soul of humanity. But on a higher level, it's the whole planetary logos. That's the entity that is ensouling the whole planet. So in many ways, that's why we call the ultimate divinity, we call that the one life. And that we are tiered, every unit of life at whatever level is contained within a vaster unit of life, within a vaster and yet a vaster, all the way up and through cosmos. My goal is not to go down that road today. That's a big subject in itself. But just understand that that's another understanding of what expansion of consciousness is really about. Always an initiation has to do with a repolarization of consciousness. Now, when the term polarization is interesting, you know, the word polarize means two, and there's a polarity. But here we're talking about a polarity that is vertical and not horizontal inside each of us. There's, on our level, it's the polarity between the soul and the personality. On a higher level, it's the polarity between the monad and the personality. And in a certain sense, if you think of it vertically, every initiation is lifting the sense of your you might say your midpoint, or that place on that spectrum where you are experiencing what I would call resting consciousness. In other words, let's put it another way. Every initiation is lifting your consciousness to a place that it will naturally stay. So there's a difference between where is my polarized consciousness, because that's going to define our evolutionary place on the journey. That's different than maybe you have a deep meditation and you really touch into something really deep and subtle, which is fantastic. But that's not resting consciousness, that's meditative experience. And then after the meditation, where does the consciousness settle into its normal day-to-day way of being? Each initiation is lifting that resting consciousness permanently to a new level deep within, a subtler level deep within. And that'll become clearer as we go through these initiations today. One of the things that happens the further you are on your journey is that you begin to realize that things like the circumstances of your life, you start to recognize that sometimes circumstance isn't so random, and that there is meaningfulness within circumstance. And in many ways, the soul speaks through what I often call circumstantial messages. And every initiation is giving you greater sensitivity to that kind of soulful communications. I mean, the soul speaks in many ways, but one of them is through circumstance. So every initiation, a kind of heightened capacity to rightly interpret circumstance is afforded an individual. Now, all the initiations that are important, the first three and even the fourth initiation, all of them have to do with what is called the causal body. Now, the causal body, I mentioned it a moment ago, is the container deep inside each of us that is holding that wisdom from the past, as well as the higher love that is soulful love. And that causal body is expanding because every incarnation, you've got more wisdom. In fact, when we talk about the subject of reincarnation, what reincarnates? It's the causal body. That's what reincarnates. Moves from one incarnation to the next, to the next, to the next. And each incarnation, it's got more stored wisdom. Each incarnation, it has more capacity to bring forth its higher quality of love. And hopefully, when you're on the initiatory path, hopefully each incarnation, that soulful quality of you, that consciousness of the causal body, is being able to express itself through the lower self with less and less distortion and less encumberment by the lower self. So that's another way of understanding what initiations are. Initiations represents the gradual transformation of the lower self so that the soul, the higher self, can more adequately and effectively and with less distortion express through that lower self as a function of service to the outer world. Because, friends, in the end, that's what it's really all about. In the end, it's all about the soul wanting to express through the personality. It wants to do that without the personality getting in the way. And that seems to be the biggest challenge for most of us. And in the process, it wants to make an uplifting contribution to something beyond itself. That's what this is really about. And every initiation, the capacity to serve, the capacity to bring more purity of soul expression into your day-to-day life expression and service is increased. And so that's a big part of it. It has a lot to do with measures of soul infusion, which we will talk about in a few moments. Okay, great. Well, let me first say that this graphic, to me, is the most important graphic in all of the esoteric work I do. And I always, every workshop I ever do, I make sure that people have this graphic because it's such a useful tool for almost any subject in esotericism. So today, it's a useful tool because I want to show you what I mean about something called the atomic matter. So can you see my pointer, Renee?
Yeah.
On the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm just focusing on the lower three planes. And this is the causal body found on the higher mental plane. And so I'm just going to talk about these planes here. Now, first thing you have to understand is that planes are planes of intelligent substance. So, for instance, let's go to the emotional plane down here. The emotional plane is made up of intelligent substance. When you experience an emotion, what are you experiencing? You're experiencing the assembly of emotional substance and its intelligent substance, and that intelligence is experienced as a feeling. When you experience a thought, you're experiencing in the mental plane, you're experiencing the assembly of mental substance, and the product of that assembly is experienced as the thought. So understand that all the planes of consciousness are planes of intelligent substance. Now, as you can see in this graphic, not only does a plane is a plane made up of intelligent substance, but notice that there are subplanes. Now, subplanes mean that every plane of consciousness is tiered with different levels of intelligent substance. So, for instance, the highest level, I'm just going to use the emotional plane as an example. The highest level of emotional substance in the emotional plane is this first level. And in fact, that's called atomic substance. And so the highest quality of emotion, the most pristine, wise, loving emotion that we could possibly experience arises from the substance of the first subplane on the emotional plane. The second subplane, you're still going to have really lofty emotion, but the emotions that arise there are a little less as lofty as the highest, okay? And when you get down to the lower subplanes, that's when you're experiencing lower emotions like envy or anger or jealousy. Those are emotions that are going to have a strong correlation to substance in the lower subplanes. Let me see if I can grab a pointer. I have a feeling my pointer disappears after a while. Can you see that red dot?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, maybe that's a little better for us. Okay, so much of initiation has a lot to do with the transformation of the personality, the lower self. Notice that from this dotted line down, these are the realms of personality. The realms of personality, okay? Now, in many ways, the process is trying to purify and transform the substance of the emotional body and the mental body and the physical body to create more and more high atomic substance in the vehicles. So there's a correlation between the purification of the personality and the composition and purification of the vehicles of the personality. There's a correlation. So the further you are on the path, the more your mental and emotional vehicles they're developing more higher subplane substance and less lower subplane substance. And the goal is eventually to have all of the substance, let's use the emotional plane as the example, all of the substance eventually become atomic, the highest, most pristine substance on the mental plane. On the emotional plane. The same with the mental plane, and the same with the etheric. The physical is divided into two parts. The etheric physical, that's your chakra system, and then the dense physical region of your experience and your life. So I bring this only up because I'm trying to share with you that every initiation is a measure, is the readiness for that initiation is based upon the percentage of atomic substance found in the vehicles, particularly the mental and the emotional. And the rule is the first initiation, 25% of your vehicles have to be atomic substance. At the second initiation, it's 50%. At the third initiation, it's 75%. And at the fourth initiation, it's 100%. And you'll see why the fourth initiation is so transitional because of that. I'm just kind of getting into more of the chemistry of the system by sharing that with you. And you don't have to remember this, but the point is to realize that there's actually kind of a very specific science associated with the measure of readiness for initiation, and it's largely based upon what is the mixture of substance in your instruments, your personality instruments, and what is the percentage of the atomic substance. Otherwise, you couldn't take initiation because your system couldn't take the voltage, because initiation is actually conferred. It's conferred by something called the rod of initiation, deep inside. And it's not your lower self that is initiated. In the end, it's the causal body itself that is initiated by the masters. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing that. I just wanted to give you a sense of the relationship between the level of purification of the instruments, personality instruments, and readiness for initiation. The other thing I want you to know about initiation is that initiation is not to be understood as, it doesn't mark, how to put this, it marks a point of attainment, but it does not bring that attainment about. That's really important. I think that might even be on the handout I gave you. It marks an attainment, but doesn't create or bring it about. In other words, you have to develop yourself to the point where you're equivalent to, let's say, a second degree initiate before you can take that initiation. It's a great master once said it this way: you are initiate before you are initiated. A lot of people think that, oh, once I become initiated, then I'm ready. Then I'm ready to do my spiritual work. No, it goes the other way around. You have to develop your consciousness first, and then initiation comes. Was there a question there or something? Renee, did you say something?
I will mention this since you asked. I think you must have got it astrally. It makes sense with a master where all of the bodies are fully in harmony, explaining it with that atomic matter that lines up beautifully, doesn't it? Because what we're here to do is to purify the emotion and the mental bodies, and you said that's where the emphasis is. So it kind of all lines up. So I'll just mention it.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So all of us are, when we say we're working on developing ourselves spiritually, what we're really doing is we're trying to transform our instruments so that the soul can be more adequately expressed through them. Yeah.
Actually, also, when that saying where a master is made, is not made, he becomes, that makes sense with what you said very clearly there as well.
Right.
Right.
Right. In fact, there's a whole process by which, for much of the evolution, we're living in what is sometimes called the world of becoming. But eventually, as you approach the third initiation, you start to sense the very beginnings of what is called the world of being. In fact, that's the title of the big 2-day event I'm doing in Nelson in March, the world of being. And but we are incrementally working through becoming. There's lower becoming, that's your lower self becoming an integrated ego. But then eventually there's higher becoming, where now you're trying to become that higher consciousness that you've been more and more sensing deep within, you see?
Okay.
And then you enter into the world of being. So
yeah, makes sense. I've just got someone, when you opened that little question there, someone's run up to the chair. So
oh, sure. Let's open it up for some questions now. Yeah.
Talking here.
Hi, William. My name's Sue.
Hello.
It's all fairly new to me, the initiation. I spend most of my time just trying to stay upright, so the initiation is kind of a big step for me. So are you saying that only one initiation in one lifetime, or can you have many initiations in one lifetime?
Yeah. Okay, great question. Wouldn't it be nice if it were many in one lifetime? But no, it's not. It's far from that. Far from that. In fact, you're more likely to live a life when you're on the path of not taking an initiation. There's distances. You will see as we go into them that the first initiation just takes it takes countless incarnations to eventually get there. But once you get there, between the first and the second initiation, there's different estimates on how long that is. But the second initiation, between the first and second, which is where a lot of people who are seriously on the path are found, between the first and the second, that's going to be a few incarnations. People estimate it between like 4 to 7 incarnations. I know that the lower self hears that. The lower self hears that and go, "Ooh, I don't like that." So if you're feeling like, "Oh, I don't like that," just know that that's your personality talking at the moment. Okay. So yeah, it's not every incarnation, and so there's a lot of, I have to say, there's a lot of glamour around having to do with initiation. Glamour means distorted perception. I mean, I remember years and years ago, we have a place in America called Sedona. And Sedona is sort of like this mecca of new age stuff going on. It's a beautiful place to see if you ever get a chance. But I mean, you could see advertisements of people, I saw advertisements of, you can take the 3rd and 4th initiation in a single weekend and it'll only cost you $2,000. I said, you got to be kidding me. This is what happens. It's far more, that's laughable. That's laughable. So I know that kind of sometimes that discourages our personality, but it kind of makes sense that if it's all about perfecting your soul's relationship to form, it's going to take a lot of incarnations. Now, the good news is that there is an acceleration that takes place. Like, so for instance, remember earlier I mentioned that in a way you're kind of working on all the initiations at the same time, particularly the first 3. Now, you'll see the first initiation has a lot to do with the physical dimension of life, the second, the emotional, and the third, the mental. And you're working on all of those things. You're trying to purify your thoughts, your feelings, and so forth. But let's say that you're working toward the first initiation. Okay. And let's say that in this incarnation, you take the first initiation. Now, the second initiation, I said it's maybe 5 to 7 lifetimes, as opposed to hundreds and hundreds of lifetimes to get to the first. What that means is, because even though before you took the first initiation, you were also working on your emotional body, even though the emphasis has been on becoming more masterful of the physical, by the time you are approaching it, you're finished the first initiation, you're now working toward the second. The time frame is less, only, let's say, 5 incarnations. That's because you've already done some of the work earlier. And the third incarnation, it is the Tibetan in the Alice Bailey writings tells us that the third initiation, you can actually take the third initiation, the same incarnation as the second, and if not that one, the subsequent incarnation. So there is a kind of acceleration that does occur. Now, part of you is probably going, well, that's good news. and I hope so, because it kind of makes sense. I hope that answers your question. Any other questions you'd like to ask?
No, I think we're good to go. Thanks.
Okay. So keep in mind now, everybody, that we're always going to open it up for questions toward the end, and we're kind of getting at that point now that in the subsequent modules we do today, if you have a question, hold on to it so that you're ready to ask it when the time is open for that. So, okay, so let me just talk a little bit about initiation itself, because you know, it's not something that you go out and do. There's nothing, it's not, as I said, it's not your personality that is initiated, it's the soul that's initiated. And it's initiated, it is said that at the first two initiations, the actual initiator, the hierophant of the initiation, is actually the Maitreya Christ. I mean, think about that. That you will face the Christ who applies what is called the rod of initiation. And now there's a whole story about the rod of initiation. That's a metaphor, of course, but it's this idea of the bestowal of some sort of a charge. That rod is said to be a rod of electric power, and it marks the transition to a whole nother regime of further development, but even your capacity to serve is increased, because every initiation, the theme of service and the capacity to serve increases, and some of it's because of that application of the rod of initiation. It is also said that each of us, when we approach the first and second initiations, you will see, we learn that there's a fourth degree initiate internally that is sponsoring you, you might say, escorting you to the initiator. However, at the third initiation, a whole different thing happens. It is said that the Christ himself steps aside, and the real ultimate initiator is Sanat Kumara. Do you know the term Sanat Kumara? Everybody in Theosophy, that's the head of Shambhala, that's the true initiator. The Christ is a representative of Sanat Kumara. So, and by the way, there's also astrological correlations to this. You know, certain initiations have certain planets that are strongly facilitating the required development to prepare for that initiation. So, for instance, as an example, the second initiation is governed by 3 planets, actually. It's the planet Venus, Neptune, and Jupiter are all heightened in their developmental influence in your consciousness, because they are all needed as a function of helping you to develop readiness for that initiation. Now, all of the initiations, particularly the first 3, are also governed by the planet Saturn. Saturn is the great disciplinarian. It is said that Saturn escorts the disciple to the gate of initiation. Saturn's also the lord of karma. So Saturn's influence is that Saturn is making sure that you do the hard work to earn the right. So Saturn forces us to do the work. And then also every initiation, the planet Uranus is involved. Uranus is in a way, Uranus is the rod of initiation. Uranus is the initiator from a planetary perspective, because it is said that Uranus is the planet that bestows cosmic electric fire, the fire of transformation. So this whole subject I could bring this into astrology very easily, and even rayology very easily. Every initiation is ruled by certain rays as well. So this is a very, very big subject, friends, and I'm giving you a kind of a condensed essentialization of what we could spend days focusing on. But when we talk about it astrologically, we're talking about not so much your birth chart, although that has a bearing on it, but how are the transits and the progressions occurring in your chart? Where is the planet Jupiter now in your chart? Where is the planet Saturn transiting now in your chart? Mm-hmm. Because it is said that you could be completely ready for initiation. All of the transformational work is ready. You've done that. And yet, if the astrology is not correctly configured, you have to wait until it is. So, and truthfully, we don't know what that configurations are. We can only speculate what they are, but nonetheless, at least we know certain ABCs of it, the planets involved for each initiation. And we also know even signs, certain signs of the zodiac have a certain energetic influence for certain initiations and less related to other initiations. So again, a big subject. Okay. So as you can see, there's a lot to this. And I'm not going to get into the planets so much, but I will talk a little bit about the rays. So we'll get into all of that as well. Any questions that you'd like to ask here? Anything you want to explore?
Greetings, William, and thanks for being here. I wanted to know if there is any astrological relevance to our current incarnation. For example, does it reflect our current causal body determining the date of birth?
There's kind of a yes and no response to that. By the way, I always think that that's the best answer to any question.
Good
But having said that, the birth chart does create a sort of core template that becomes relevant in the incarnation, but it's a bit dangerous to assume that because this chart has a lot of, let's say, a lot of Capricorn in it, and Capricorn happens to be the sign that has the strongest relationship to initiation, just as a sign, that this person is going to take an initiation in that life. We can't do that. And the reason for that is this. And maybe I could use you as an example. So I'm sorry, what was your first name?
Kirsty.
But I wanted to ask you, where were you born?
I was born in Wellington and I'm a Capricorn, by the way.
That's the way it works. Okay. So Capricorn. So okay. So let's assume does Wellington have a zoo?
Yes.
It does. Fantastic. Okay. Let's assume that on the very day and at the very minute that you were born, a chimpanzee was born in the zoo in Wellington. That chimp is going to have exactly the same chart. Exactly. Do we interpret them the same way? Well, there's some people you kind of wonder, but okay. But
Getting into dangerous ground now.
Yeah. But the point is that you can have a chart and there's a whole spectrum of high and low of what it might represent. And that's true with people as well as with animals, etc. That's why I say it's very dangerous to just look at a chart at face value and say, oh, this is a chart where an initiation is going to happen. It could be the chimp. You know what I mean? So,
thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Very welcome.
Anyone else?
A little bit more about the causal body to kind of highlight this a little bit, because there's a whole study of the causal body's philosophy, and it's a rich inquiry. But one of the things that's interesting, I'm going to show you an image of a lotus that is kind of representing the causal body. Let me do that. It's also been called the egoic lotus. Now, your soul's vehicle isn't really a lotus, okay? But that's a metaphor. But the petals of the lotus are said to be symbolic of qualities. So there are 12 petals of the causal body. Stated differently, there are 12 fundamental types of intelligences that have to be unfolded. Now, when you evolve your consciousness, a petal that is unfolded means that the intelligence, the soulful intelligence of that petal is now able to be expressed through the personality without distortion. So in other words, the whole path is probably, you could talk about it more in terms of a path of slowly unfolding all the petals of the lotus. And when at the very center of the lotus, this little starburst, that's the monad. That's the pure beingness. That's the core. That's the jewel in the lotus. And so when we open the petals of the lotus, we're slowly working our way to unfold the consciousness of those petals. Eventually, they lead us right to the monad. And you will see as we go through each of the initiations and the discussions about them that there's a correlation. But I will say this, that the outer tier of petals, in fact, I'm going to show you another slide here that'll show you these. I've just put letters in here. Now, without going too far into it, the green petals are called the knowledge petals. That's what the K represents. It's in those petals where the knowledge and the intelligence of the causal body is found, the soul's intelligence. The blue petals are called the love petals. The red petals are called the sacrifice petals. And the final petals are called the synthesis petals. Now, for these petals are opening before you're even on the path. In fact, when you're at the time when you finally wake up to the path, before you take an initiation, but you're waking up to the soul, the outer tier of petals, the knowledge petals, have already been open, and that's helped to integrate the personality. The love petals have also been open, but now it's the red petals. These are the sacrifice petals. They're closely connected to will. And what this means is you notice that there's another letter next to it. So this is called the sacrifice knowledge petal. This one here, I should put my little red pointer. Hopefully you can see the pointer. It's sacrifice love. And then this is sacrifice sacrifice. Now, there's a whole discussion about what all that means. I only bring this up because I want you to realize that when we talk about initiation, we're talking about the first three initiations, which are by far the most important for our level of development. We're talking about the unfolding of these red petals. So the sacrifice knowledge petal, that opens at the first initiation. And what is that? How does that experienced at the first initiation? Well, it means I'm going to sacrifice all I know and all I'm able to do in support of humanity's upliftment. At the second initiation, that's the sacrifice love petal. That's what moves you from personal love to impersonal love. I sacrifice love and the loving nature of my inner life. I sacrifice it in support of the love of the one humanity. And the sacrifice petal is corresponds to the third initiation when it opens. And I'll never forget what the Tibetan in the Alice Bailey writing said about this one. He said, when the sacrifice petal opens it and making you eligible for the third initiation, he says it, and I'm going to quote him here. He says, it represents the utter sacrifice of all forever. The utter sacrifice of all forever. In other words, your whole life and everything that you know of yourself from soul downward is given over to the service of the greater life and given over to the service of the ashram, the inner ashram. So as you can see, these petals have a deep relationship to initiation. Now, many of you are maybe familiar with the 7 rays. So there are 7 types of souls, and every soul is governed by a type of ray. They have the same petals, but they are energetically influenced by a different ray. So in the unfolding of all these petals, the ray tendency of the soul makes some of these petals unfold easily, and others unfold with more difficulty. So let me just give you an example. Let us say that, and I wouldn't be surprised if many of you are working from the first initiation to the second. So let's say you're And let's say that you're a second ray soul. I'm making this up, but let's say you're a second ray soul. Now, the second ray is the ray of, it's the ray of love and wisdom. So it's a strong love ray. Now, even before you're on the path, that makes this tier of petals, the blue tier, those open fast, even before you're on the path, because the soul itself is governed by the love ray. So those petals, it's like a natural opening for them. It's natural. Whereas that same person may have more difficulty opening the knowledge petals because maybe they're much more heart-oriented than mind-oriented. So when I say these petals open, I'm speaking more generically, but they do, the pace of their opening will vary according to the ray of your soul. Now, if I focus on initiation, and these three petals, the red ones, the sacrifice petals, and let's say that you're a second ray soul, the second, to take the second initiation is going to feel more naturally and able to do that because this petal here is naturally second ray, and this is the one that supports the opening of the taking of the second initiation. While the third initiation, which is about here, this has a lot to do with higher will. This person may have more trouble taking the third initiation. In an awkward way, what I'm trying to say is the ease at which we are able to take any particular initiation will have a relationship to the ray you're on and the initiation you face, because it will have a bearing on the ease or challenge of a particular petal of the lotus opening. It probably gets a little bit too much into the minutia of it, but just to understand that there's a whole dynamics going on in your causal body related to this. I know we're going to take a break in just a few minutes, but let me set the stage for our next section, okay? And that's where we're really going to go into the initiations. But first, I want you to realize that in this philosophy, there are three terms that we need to know. And I'm going to put up another graphic because it really is a useful graphic in many ways, but particularly for initiation. And it's titled Stages of Infusion. I hope you can see it. And I'm going to get my pointer out here again, so it's easy. So in this philosophy, we have three terms we use a lot: the word aspirant, the word disciple, and the word initiate. Three big terms. An aspirant is one who has awoken to the soul, and as it says here, there's a recognition of the soul, but there's no soul infusion yet. And it's what we call the beginning of the probationary path. And I'm going to dive into the probationary path when we meet after break. Now, that's what we mean by an aspirant. They're waking up to the soul, they're sensing something higher within themselves, and they're aspiring, the aspirant, they're aspiring to start to live more from that sensed perspective. So that's where the word comes from, okay? Now, there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens at the awakening and on the probationary path that we'll talk about after break. I just want to lay out this model for you for the whole thing. This is the phase where we begin the work of discipleship. You see, in this philosophy, the word disciple has more than one usage. In many ways, disciple means to be a disciple of your own soul, to be a disciple of your own higher promptings. That's discipleship. Yes, you're also a disciple that is part of an ashram. That's true. And there's a master of it. That's true too. But the most, it has been said that the most important master to follow is often the one least followed. And that's your own higher nature, your own soul nature. That's the master to follow. So this is the area where most of my work with students are found, because most people and most serious people on the path are on the path of discipleship, okay? Partial soul infusion, meaning the soul. Are you also seeing me in the corner? I don't know if you
Yes.
are. Okay. So if the soul is infusing itself into the personality, and that infusion, it's trying to transform the personality so that it becomes a useful tool that the soul can utilize to interact in the outer world in service. Because the soul needs your personality. You know, sometimes you hear the idea, kill the personality. Nonsense. Your personality is destined to be the outer garment that the soul uses in order to serve and make an uplifting contribution. It needs the mental body of the personality to shape thoughts that have the power to transform. It needs the emotional body of the personality to create warmth and emotional connectedness with others. It needs the physical instrument to do its bidding, to do the actual tangible thing that needs to be done in the outer world to make a difference. And so initiation is really all about the gradual process of that personality yielding to the authority of the soul. And every initiation means that more of that personality has done the yielding. And so just as a simple form, I could say this kind of represents the first initiation. This represents the second initiation. I know that doesn't mean a lot to you because you don't know yet what those initiations are about, but just know that this is a visual model, and I'll probably bring it back to the screen during the day to help you remember it and connect to it. But just understand that this is what this is really all about. And this is why sometimes in the literature you'll hear the term the dual life of the disciple. The dual life of the disciple is because a disciple, which most of you I would imagine would be, the disciple is where you have part of the personality is soul infused. Let's look at the image here. This part is soul infused, but you have a lot that's not soul infused. Now, the soul infused portion of the personality, number one, has been purified enough to be infused. Now, you know about the substance of the vehicles, you know, the atomic substance. So there's enough for that level of infusion. And that's the part of the personality that says, you know, I sense a deeper calling in here. I sense a higher prompting. I sense a kind of intuitive wisdom. And you know what? I'm going to trust it. That's the part of the personality that's infused by the soul. But then you have this whole thing down here that's not yet infused by the soul. And what's that? Well, that's the personality that says, no way. That's the personality that says, let ambition rule and the door stand wide. Or that's the part of the personality that says, not yet. I'm not ready. Okay? And so this is why the path can be a challenge, and there's conflict that takes place in the path and in the journey, because we have these two parts of the personality that are, one is able to sense the soul and trust it, and the other can't sense it or doesn't trust it. And the more soul infusion that is occurring, the more that trust factor and that letting go is occurring. But there will always be conflict in this path, because what happens is this: as you awaken to the soul and become more and more committed to trying to live it, and you even start adopting disciplines to do that. So you might say, you know, I'm sensing this higher prompting. I want to trust this, and I'm gonna start to meditate, for instance, or I'm gonna really commit myself to do something to help others, and I'm going to study, and I'm going to build my higher consciousness, and all of that's good. So you say to yourself, that's how I'm going to now live my life. Well, the lower self, actually the lower part of the lower self, that's the part that says, no way. That's the part of the lower self that says, hey, just because you hear this little faint voice, you think I'm going to let go of the reins? Forget it. And so a battle begins. a battle between the soul consciousness and the personality of consciousness. It's a battle between wisdom and knowledge. I'm just kind of using a metaphor, but it's like this: the soul, the personality saying, "Hey, I've been running the show for countless incarnations, and just because you think you hear this little faint voice inside, you think I'm going to let go of the reins? Forget it, says the personality, and a battle begins." And so this is why the path is not easy. There's always going to be crisis. There's always going to be a crisis associated with an initiation. It's a crisis that crisis is a prelude to every initiation. And it can be a protracted crisis over many years, which is most commonly the fact, or it can be acute. And there's a whole explanation of why humanity has to evolve through crisis. And I think what I'll do is I will share that with you after the break so that you better understand that. But let me just quickly continue on this part of the journey until we get here. So this represents the third initiation, which is a huge thing where now the soul and personality are completely fused together. And now we are bestowed the title of initiate with a capital I. Sometimes you'll see in reading the material, particularly the Alice Bailey world, where you'll see it if it's lowercase initiate, they'll say a first degree initiate, a second degree initiate. But when it's uppercase, it means third degree initiate. You're truly called an initiate. And that's the moment where you awaken to the monad for the first time. We'll get into that. And so there's a whole new kind of awakening that occurs here. So we're going to go through a deep discussion of these phases and even a couple beyond this and for the rest of the day. So hang on.
So I hear a lot of people asking, what's my purpose? You know, what's my work this lifetime? Where does it lie? So my question is it helpful to see where our transits are, you know, year to year, and then to work out what our ray is so that we have indicators to where our work lies this lifetime?
Sure. Although just keep in mind that there are certain clues to soul's purpose that happen. You don't fully know your purpose, that is to say, from the ashram's perspective, because remember, your soul is part of an inner ashram. I know people think ashram, they think India, but that's not where the ashram is. The ashram is not in India. Dare I say it's not in New Zealand either. Okay. Where is the soul? It's deep within. And it's the ashram, the ashram, your soul is part of an inner ashram. And according to the ray of your soul, if you're a second ray soul, you're part of the second ray ashram. And your soul is an agent that is representing that ashram. And so it's really the ashram itself that holds the purpose, and the soul is its representative. So, but until there's complete soul personality fusion, which doesn't even take place till the third initiation, as you'll soon see, we get pieces of it. We get elements of it. But to know your purpose from an ashram perspective, that doesn't happen until you truly become an initiate. But there are certain clues that come into play, and we'll, at the first and the second initiation, we'll talk about that. But in the meantime, what you've said is true. The more you can understand your own ray nature, the more you're navigating into soul purpose, definitely. Also, a clue to purpose is found in the rising sign of your chart as well as the sun sign. Those two have an important there's a higher meaning to the rising sign. A lot of times in astrology, they talk about it as your persona, meaning the masks you wear in the outer world. And that's true on a low level, but on a much higher level, there's the rising sign holds the clue to the soul's a clue to the soul's incarnational intention. But the big purpose of the soul, and this is something the personality doesn't like to hear, is multi-incarnational. In other words, we tend to think of the soul as, what's my purpose? And I'm going to do my purpose in this life. I'm going to try. Well, from an ashram's perspective, your soul isn't playing, its purpose isn't this life. That's just a segment of it. It's many lifetimes. And so it's always a work in progress. Bear with me, because you'll see that as we get into these initiations, we'll start talking about purpose as well. But what you have said is actually very true. The more you can understand your rheological nature, the more you understand some of the features of your chart that are important, that kind of lean toward soul calling in this life, as well as the North Node. That's another point that's very important in the chart as well. All of those, knowing the higher meaning of their placement, gives a clue, an element of purposeful understanding of the life. So, okay.
Thank you. All right. Thanks for your.
Yeah.